Good afternoon. And good afternoon to all of you who are watching live or eventually recorded. So today, what I would like to do is take a further step along the way in discussing the specific events which led to the alienation of the colonists from their British cousins, friends, family. And I think the key word that I would express today is alienation. And that comes from the root alien, to start to feel different, to start to feel foreign, to start to be in a position where the commonality of what you had no longer is the predominant governing ethos and attitude and outlook that you had. So we've discussed before some of the things that had started to separate the colonists from the British people in Great Britain, both living here on their own, opening the frontier on their own, living in a much more egalitarian society where government hardly existed at all, and most government tended to be very local and generic to the area, the sense of being in control of their own lives. We also discussed the fact that after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, which we Americans call the French and Indian War, the British found themselves as the greatest empire in the world, with the greatest, most successful army, the greatest and most successful navy, and the largest debt of any country in the world. So the British government began to look for ways to secure more revenue, and part of that search was a search to find new sources of revenue, because the people of Britain had been significantly taxed during the war, and the most obvious source was going to be the 13 colonies. So with that in mind, what had happened in essence when the British government had passed what was known as the Stamp Act was the development of this chasm, this gap in understanding between the two parties. And I've referred previously to the fact that this is a time, as we reflect on it, of mutual misunderstanding, misappreciation of what the other side was intending by their acts. The acts were very, very clear, as the Stamp Act was very, very clear. You may recall that the Stamp Act required a revenue stamp on virtually every piece of paper, not simply deeds for the transfer of property, but letters that you wrote to your cousin, or any newspaper that might be printed, or any piece of paper where there was any transmission of any kind of information or data required a revenue stamp. Now, from the British point of view, what's the big deal? We do it here in Britain. Britain had a Stamp Act. Britain taxed this kind of paper, whether it was a newspaper or any kind of publication. A novel, they didn't have novels as we know them, but stories. So what was so unusual? Well, to the colonists, what was unusual was the fact that for the first time in the 150 years that they had been independent, the British government, 3,000 miles away, was imposing an internal tax on the most fundamental of all of their commercial activities. So if I was selling you any kind of goods, had to be a stamp on it. If you were paying me, had to be a stamp on it. So now what the colonists began to perceive is a radical change in the nature and way in which they functioned internally to their own colonies. And they also began to feel in a different way than they had felt before, a kind of coalescing, a kind of common outlook with the other colonies. To be perfectly frank about it, the commonality between New Hampshire and Georgia in many respects was small. Georgia was a slave colony. New Hampshire was a community of small independent farmers. The black population of Georgia was anywhere from 30 to 40%, and in New Hampshire, it might be 1 or 2%. So there wasn't that much that they had in common, except now they began to have in common a view that this kind of an act, the Stamp Act, was imposed on them whether they lived in Georgia or whether they lived in New Hampshire. In other words, the Americans, we can begin to call them that, not just the colonists, began to see themselves as having a kind of a unity as a result of Britain acting upon all of the colonies in a uniform way. There wasn't an exception for Maryland and Connecticut. They weren't excluded from the Stamp Act. So if the British government was treating all of the colonies the same, they began to see themselves as having a kind of a unity in opposition to what the British were doing. And the hotbed of the opposition was Massachusetts. And the hotbed of the Massachusetts opposition was Boston. So it was in Boston that you began to see the rise of a radical element. By radical, I mean something different than you might conceive. They weren't at that point thinking of overthrowing the government. They weren't at that point suggesting that they were disloyal to His Majesty George III. They were radical in the fact that they began to protest in organized fashion. That was very different than what had happened before. And one of the leaders of the hotbed, the radicals you might call them, was a guy named Sam Adams. No, Sam Adams was not the founder of the brewery, but he was the cousin of John. And of course, John Adams is one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. We'll have cause to mention him a great deal of time. What was radical about Sam was his organization of the local community in Boston. And by local community, I mean the working people in Boston. Boston was, of course, one of the two major urban centers of the colonies, the other being Philadelphia. And what was happening there is you had workmen who worked as mechanics. They shoed horses, they loaded ships, they worked printing presses. They were not just farmers, and there were groups of them. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Boston today, or Boston when we were kids and we were brought up. But Boston was a city then, and it is today, a city of neighborhoods. And there was the North Side, and there was South Boston. And these folks organized in local communities. And what Adams did is he started organizing committees within these local communities. And they paraded around something called the Liberty Tree. That is to say, there was a tree in the local community that was hung with all kinds of colors, and people would dance around and sing patriotic songs and give speeches and listen to speeches protesting the Stamp Act. But it went more than that. To collect the revenue from the Stamp Act, the British government appointed certain people who would be stamp agents in each of the colonies. So what a stamp agent was an agent of the British government. And the system then was different than the kind of bureaucratic governmental system we basically are used to. The governments were not structured to have civil servants. So a stamp agent would buy stamps from the government, and his job was to charge people more than he paid the government for the stamps and make sure that the stamps were used. So the government didn't pay him a salary, he made a profit. So the more stamps that were used, and I don't remember the dollar amounts, if he was paying $1 to the government for 100 stamps and he was charging $2 for 100 stamps, well, that was his profit. That was the way he administered the Stamp Act, and he would hire agents to go around in the towns to make sure that people were buying the stamps so they could get them stamped on the legal documents. By the way, as an aside, I don't know any of you who may recall when you bought real property, and you may have recalled that at settlement, there was affixed to the deed certain stamps. We still do it, except the stamps now are $1,000, a $5,000 stamp, and it's affixed to the deed. So this process of revenue agents, stamp agents, was the method by which the government proposed to enforce the law. And what happened was they became the objects of protest. This kind of a protest was not simply a matter of folks getting together outside the stamp agent's house or place of business and holding up a couple of signs and walking back and forth and, yelling all kinds of things. No, this was violent protests. Throwing rocks, breaking into the houses and offices, ransacking them, burning them down. These were not conservative mobs of folks just exercising their First Amendment rights. Of course, the First Amendment didn't exist at the time. These were violent Sons of Liberty, and as they were known. And this was not only in Boston, this was seen in New York, this was seen in Philadelphia. This kind of an example existed throughout the colonies. But the colonists also, through what I had described last time as committees of correspondence, and Anne Cantor asked about, and she was quite correct, weren't there newspapers spreading a lot of this information? So through the local newspapers, through committees of correspondence, and especially word of mouth in small communities, people began to get the idea that one of the ways in which to protest the Stamp Act was to strike back at Britain through what they perceived, and correctly so, was one of the British's worst weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and that is trade with America. At this time, and we're talking the 1770s now, about 50% of British exports were to the 13 colonies. And about 30% of their imports came from the British colonies. the majority of the ships that were built for the Royal Navy were built here in the colonies. And the manufactured goods that the colonists imported, iron pots for cooking, stoves, any kind of furniture, basically was coming from Britain. So the beginning of a boycott movement, which spread pretty quickly throughout the colonies, struck at the British merchant class. As an aside, but an important aside, by this point in the 1770s, we were on the cusp of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, but we were full born into the Mercantile Revolution, so that the power structure in Britain was less and less the hereditary nobility and more the merchants and the business people in Bristol, in London, in Liverpool, who were dependent upon export and import trade, who employed more and more people. There were more and more people in Britain starting to work for wages instead of working the land or farming or raising their crops. So the impact of a boycott was felt significantly among the merchant class. And for the first time, starting in around the 1730s, 1740s, by the 1770s, the merchant class had become a force politically in Parliament. More and more of them had acquired sufficient wealth so they could elect their own members, their own friends, and therefore there was a political impact in Parliament as a result of the boycotts. So the British were not insensitive to what was going on. And I've mentioned a number of times that one of the key geographic factors, perhaps the most important one in this whole period of time, is the separation of the colonies from the home country, the separation of 3,000 miles of ocean. And that is crucial, but not sufficient. So the British understood what was going on. They understood that there was violence against stamp agents. They understood that there was boycotts going on. It had an impact, even though it started 3,000 miles away. So what did they do? They reacted, one would say, pretty rationally. They repealed the Stamp Act. So now, on the one hand, these colonists have protested, they have been violent, they've struck at our mercantile establishment, and we didn't send troops to kill them. What did we do? We repealed the act that they were protesting. They should be grateful. And they were, but they learned another lesson. What was the other lesson? That they had power. That they had power. And that they didn't have power simply because Sam Adams raised a group of people to attack that Stamp Act office in Boston. They had power because the colonies got together, not structurally in some sort of Congress, but got together to act. And those actions were effective. So the British repealed the Stamp Act. Victory for the colonists, except, and there was always an exception here, Except the British were determined on one point. They were determined to make sure that their authority to levy taxes, their authority to legislate for the colonies was undisputed. Okay, we won't tax you for stamps, but they passed what was called the Declaratory Act. This was an act that simply said Parliament had absolute power to make laws for the colonies. What this meant in a real sense to the British was a huge concession to the colonists, retaining only the rights to the ultimate authority to legislate. Sounds reasonable. And it was reasonable to the British. What was unreasonable to the colonists was the fact that this seemed to them to overrule their own power in their colonies, in their colonial assemblies, whether the General Assembly in Pennsylvania or the Supreme Court, the General Court in Massachusetts, or the House of Burgesses in Virginia, no longer could be viewed as independent bodies controlling their own destiny if the British said, we have the absolute power to act. And absolute power means the power to overrule, the power to control, the power to negate. So the British were making a tremendous concession, a tremendous concession. At the same time, it was a tremendous provocation. And I've said many times now that these two groups of folks were more or less talking past each other. They were more or less beginning to feel alienated in the sense they couldn't understand what the problem was on the other side. Why didn't the colonists understand the concession we just made? Why didn't the British understand our rights to govern ourselves? The fact that the Stamp Act was abolished didn't mean that the British had solved their revenue problem. And they had a new prime minister, Lord Townshend. And Lord Townshend recognized, at least the way of British thinking, the government thinking, well, we can't levy direct taxes. The Stamp Act kind of thing, that isn't going to work. We've seen what the colonists have done. So instead, what we'll do is we'll levy duties, import duties, on the colonists. Now, we had been controlling trade between the colonies and Britain and the colonies and the rest of the world since the colonies were created. There can't be any objection. This is not a whole new slew of different kinds of laws. These were not direct taxes. So clearly the colonists had no real grounds to object. What could they object to? Well, we're going to reorganize the customs service so that the imports on silk and tea and glass and other manufactured goods could be enforced. And what was so bad about that? Look, we've had these import duties on the colonists. We've had control of the trade, and the colonists kept avoiding paying for it by extensive smuggling. Now, I can't give you any statistics that would indicate that smuggling was one of the major commercial ventures of the colonists, but it certainly was. Remember, this is a time where there was no cell phones in your pocket with the great computer companies or governments monitoring every single piece of your behavior. Rather, people got on a ship, and whether it was in Delaware Bay or the James or out of Charlotte, they went wherever they wanted. In addition to which, there were almost no customs officers here. So what had happened was the substance of the trade that the colonists had with the rest of the world as well as Britain was done by smuggling. And why did people smuggle? They didn't want to pay the duties. They didn't want to pay the taxes. And guess what? They didn't. They were successful. And the British government is saying, hold on, we have a law, we're allowed to enforce the law, and these colonists, all they are, what is this whole uproar about? Us enforcing laws that have been in place for all these years? Us trying to crush smuggling? Is that a justification for their attitude? And the answer was, yes, it was a justification to the colonists. They saw the attempt to place more and more British customs ships on the American coast and customs officers here as a means of cutting out the smuggling and smothering their trade with the rest of the world. I've alluded previously to the fact that a great deal of the colonial trade was with the West Indies, where they would bring in sugar and turn it into molasses. Most of that was with the British colonies, but a huge amount of that was with the French colonies in the West Indies. And most of the islands in the West Indies, when we do these Caribbean cruises, most folks don't realize that their primary economic basis for existence was sugar in those days. So what was happening by the British attempting to enforce customs law was undercutting one of the fundamental legs on which the colonial mercantile economy stood. So it might have appeared to the British as reasonable to the colonialists after the Stamp Act. After the Stamp Act, and after the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Acts seemed like the British were conspiring to destroy the rights of the colonists. It was clear there was a pattern here that the colonists began to perceive. A pattern of the suppression of the historic rights, a pattern of the destruction of the way they lived and functioned, all out of the need of the British for money, when in fact the colonists had raised their own militias and paid them during the French and Indian War. So the colonists began to see a pattern of control, and they were right. Not that it was a suspicious conspiracy, rather it was pretty blatant and clear that that's exactly what the British government wanted. It wanted more and more control. So what began to occur now, in the face of the Stamp Act in the face of the Declaratory Act, in the face of the Townshend Act, was a rising resistance to the actions of Britain in terms of colonial life. And one of the most famous pieces that was written was letters from a Pennsylvania farmer. And the gentleman who wrote it was the name of John Dickinson, and he was a Philadelphia businessman. He wasn't a farmer. Although he had a farm, most folks who had acquired some wealth out of commerce had a farm. Most folks who had, in Philadelphia, who had acquired some wealth had vacation homes in places like Chestnut Hill. Truly, that's where they went for vacations, because it was hilly and cooler, and in the summer, the city was a cesspool of disease. In any event, the Pennsylvania farmer, John Dickinson, was an extremely bright businessman and lawyer. And what he began to argue is that what the pattern of British laws that had been passed since the end of the war was a pattern that violated the natural rights of the colonists as Englishmen. And there's an irony here. I want to pause for a moment to talk about the irony. The irony of appealing to rights as Englishmen. If we recall back to the time of colonial settlement, why did folks leave Britain? They left Britain, the Catholics coming to Maryland, the Pilgrims going to Massachusetts, the Quakers coming to Pennsylvania. They left Britain because they had been repelled by British moral corruption as they saw it, by a society that their rights as people to pray as they wished and lived it as they wished really were non-existent. They didn't come to assert rights as Englishmen. They came to reject the treatment by the British of their rights. But now, 150 years later, Dickinson and the Pennsylvania farmer begins the argument that we are merely asserting our historic rights as Englishmen, going back to Magna Carta, going back to the British Civil War, going back to the Glorious Revolution, the rights of petition, all of which were in fact enhancements of rights that Britons, Englishmen in particular, had. But the appeal here now was a conservative appeal. It wasn't an appeal, let's break up the government, let's overthrow the king, down with Parliament. It was a conservative appeal to rights that they perceived that they had as Englishmen. And Sam Adams, along with others, but predominantly him, had created a letter written to the other colonies urging a joint kind of resistance. A joint kind of resistance to the Townshend Act, to the revenues that were supposed to be raised by it. Again, beginning to reinforce the concept that acting together would be effective because it had been demonstrated to them through their resistance to the Stamp Act that it had been effective. And starting to appeal to folks from other colonies for an emerging, nascent, evolving sense of a kind of self-characterization as Americans. Not the kind of idea that made loyalty to your colonies subservient, but a kind of separate ideal. Excuse me. Excuse me to you on TV, you won't get infected, I guarantee. So the Massachusetts Assembly went a little bit further, okay? The Massachusetts Assembly created more and more of these committees and funded them to enhance resistance. The governor of Massachusetts at that time, a gentleman named Hillsborough, told the assembly, known as the General Court, to withdraw the support for these resistance movements and to end resistance to the law, or he threatened to dissolve the assembly. In Massachusetts, the assembly was called the General Court. They had a judicial court, and they had the General Court. So if I refer to the General Court, think of it as the Massachusetts Assembly. So what was now happening is that the British governors, the British governors were starting to see that this was not simply a group of guys in downtown Boston who were throwing some bricks at the house where the stamp collector lived. They began to perceive the organization of the resistance as a significant threat. And they were right. It was. So what did the British government do? The same thing they did with the Stamp Act. They repealed the Townshend Act. And again, if you step back and you think about it for a second, you can argue sincerely that the British government was being responsive, that they were hearing the wishes of the colonists, that we're not going to go ahead with everything that we said we were going to do. They repealed all of the duties except on tea. Now, why was tea important? I don't know how many of you begin your mornings with tea. I'm sure some of you do. Most of us, including my bride and myself, begin our mornings with coffee, which really was not a factor in those days. So tea was not grown here. Tea was basically imported from India. And it was imported by a company called the British East India Company. And I want to take a moment to lay that out for you as a basis of what we're going to see. The British East India Company was a private company, and it had its own government and its own army in India. The British East India Company, along with the Royal Navy and Royal troops, had defeated the French in India in the 7 Years' War. The interesting thing about the British East India Company is that most of the shares of the British East India Company were owned by the nobility in England, by the upper merchant class in England. And the next thing to know about the British East India Company is that it was thoroughly incompetent and corrupt. And the final thing to know about the British East India Company is that it was unprofitable. Well, I own shares in unprofitable, corrupt company. I really got to do something about that. So Parliament now begins to look at what had happened in the colonies and the withdrawal of all of these other duties. But the duty on tea meant that the colonists couldn't get tea from the Dutch. The Dutch owned what was in those days called the Netherlands East Indies, which today we know as Indonesia. And the Dutch were also in a country called Ceylon, which is now known as Sri Lanka. Both tea-producing countries. And what they were doing was undercutting the tea from the British East India Company. So the British government said a couple of things. Well, we got to get tea into the colonies. And we're faced with a problem in the colonies, particularly in Boston. We have an assembly in Massachusetts run by a bunch of hooligans, the same kind of people who destroyed the Stamp Act. Stamp Act officers. Same bunch of people who were leading all these protests. So we can't put up with this very much anymore. Because what we're seeing here is we're seeing something suspiciously like an incipient rebellion. We're seeing organized resistance. Well, how can we, as a legitimate government, just let that go by? How much longer can we let it go by? We need to do something to enforce our authority. The best way to enforce our authority is with our troops. So they order the commander of the British forces in North America, General Gates, to send 2 regiments of troops to Boston. And when the troops came to Boston, they didn't stay in barracks. Now, some of you here may have served in the armed forces. I did a long time ago. I feel almost back to revolutionary days, but I lived in barracks. I lived on a base. It was isolated from civilian population, but there were no barracks. There were no bases. Where did the troops live? They lived in people's homes. So you had a 2-floor home, and you had your cows and pigs downstairs, and in the front you had the little store making candles and selling them, and you had 2 rooms upstairs. Well, you're taking a sergeant and a private in one of those 2 rooms, and if you have to move your whole family into the other room, you just have to. Imagine now, just guess what the British government paid as rent for that room upstairs on the 2nd floor. You got it. I love the Spanish word nada. It's better than no. Nada. In addition to which, ladies, you had to do the cooking for them. Ladies, you had to do the washing for them. It was called quartering, Q-U-A-R-T-E-R-I-N-G. T-E-R-T-I-N-G. And if you read our Constitution, there's a prohibition on quartering. I've alluded to, and we'll see later, that a great deal of the society we live in, the structure of our government, our Constitution, is an emerging kind of thing from these days and these times. Well, resistance was not broken. Indeed, the Massachusetts Assembly began to organize resolves and petitions and correspondence to the other colonies, suggesting that the rights that they had by reason of their original charter and their rights as Englishmen were being destroyed. And now they were faced in Massachusetts, in Boston, with something distinctly very different from what had happened before. Now they were faced with troops on the street. And it was not a compatible, loving relationship between the populace and the troops. I recall seeing on some YouTube thing in the last couple of weeks that somebody saw one of our servicemen on a plane sitting back in tourist, and they were sitting in first class, and they got up and had that person, that service person, come up and sit in their seat, and they went back and sat in tourism. The respect we have for those who serve our country is genuine, it's deep, it's meaningful, and did not exist at all. In fact, there are stories, so I'll tell you one story. If it's apocryphal, I apologize, but it makes the point. The British troops were paid virtually nothing. They were given starvation wages, if you could call that. So they were always looking for an opportunity to get more employment. So one day, and I'm paraphrasing and modifying it, but one day one of the British soldiers is walking along when a fellow named John stops him and says, would you like some work? To come to my house on your off-duty hours, and you do some work, and I'll pay you 6 pence or whatever it was that he was going to pay them. And the soldier said, fine. You know, I'd love to do that. He says, okay, what kind of work is it? It's cleaning out the leftovers from the pigs, okay? And you can understand that there's a limit to the language I'm going to use being broadcast over the internet, as maybe it will be. So he was going to clean slop. And the soldier didn't quite appreciate that. And he took a swing, and John took a swing, and they were rolling on the ground when a couple of other people came over and started beating up on the soldier, who saw a couple of other soldiers come over and started beating up. There was a constancy of physical conflict. There was a constancy of anger. There was a constancy of hostility. There was a constancy of cursing and spitting and throwing things. There was anger. There was hostility. There was violence. And that, dear friends, is the setting for us to reflect for a moment on what the famous Boston Massacre was about, which we will deal with not next time, but the time after next. We're going to take a detour next time. And I want to give you a preview because it's important that I at least set the basis for it. So far, basically, I've been talking about structural events, the events of distance and land, the events of charters and history, the events of laws and acts and enforcement and confusion and some violence and hostility. But there was something else that was going on at the time. And there was a development of a concept of belief that there were things that were more important than the current government. There were things called natural rights. There were things called self-government. So next time we're going to delve in to some of the history of ideas, which along with these events and others we'll see, terminated not simply in the famous Boston Massacre, not simply on the March on Lexington and Concord, not simply on the Continental Congresses, but also in the beginnings of the ideas of what America comes to mean. So that's for next time. Thank you. Now, does anybody have any questions? No, you can't answer. What? 2 weeks from now.
2 weeks, yes.
2 weeks. Yes, Peter.
While the Stamp Act was in effect, what means did the stamp agents have to enforce the use of the stamps?
They had the local sheriff, okay, and the local court. So the government such as existed basically meant that if somebody didn't pay the revenue, okay, there would be a judicial proceeding. The sheriff would go out and seize the person, bring them into court, or seize the property. Very, very, very ineffective way of enforcing law. I mean, there were no police forces. Oh, 1 second. We need to have you on the microphone so other folks who aren't here can see.
The sheriff was British, or was he?
No, the sheriff was a local official, locally elected, and had been appointed, generally speaking, okay, the local sheriff, generally speaking, was appointed by the local assembly, the General Assembly in Pennsylvania, the House of Burgesses. When you got up to the other courts, okay, to the appellate courts, those courts, the judges of those courts were appointed by the Crown and actually appointed by the governor, who had been authorized by the Crown to appoint judges. But one other point, and then I'm going to come back. If it's a long-winded answer, I'm sorry. There still was the right to trial. There still were jury trials. So when I talked to you last time, and we talked about the fact that some people who were smuggling were supposed to be taken to Halifax in an admiralty court without jury trial. That was a violation that the colonists felt, and pretty justifiably, of their historic rights to a jury trial. So to follow up your question and Peter's question, if the sheriff took you into court, you had a trial by jury. And most of the jurors were your neighbors. Yeah. And they were doing the same thing you were doing. Yeah, right. You know, we talk about trial by our peers here. well, our population is so colossal that, and the courts will not let your neighbor sit on your case. In those days, of course, that was the way it was done. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer.
One other question, were there any hangings
With the hangings, there were lots of hangings, but not for violations of the Stamp Act. I mean, the nature of criminal law in those days was what we would term barbaric. I mean, theft meant death if it didn't mean imprisonment in debtor's prison for the rest of your life. It was not a pleasant society. It was not kumbaya.
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on this question. Those officers, I mean, the money collector, they got money?
Yeah, the revenue officers.
The revenue officers. But how did, I mean, they came to your door and said, give us money for your stamps, or how do they?
Okay, you need a stamp for this deed.
You bought
Okay? You had to pay me money for me to give you the stamp, and then I took a, what is this called, a stamp,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
There was an actual stamp, and then they embossed it, oops, whatever it was.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, so you paid me $1, I had paid the government 50 cents for the stamp.
Okay. Other questions? I'm sorry.
All right, thank you
Okay.
very much. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your attendance. And in 2 weeks,